Hello and welcome. We are your hosts Sandesh and Anshuman. In each episode, we will pick one seemingly boring security topic and talk about the good, the bad, and everything in between. So join us for some fun, some conversations, and some super hot takes about all things security in the Boring AppSec podcast.
Hey, welcome to Boring AppSec podcast episode 1, Anshuman.
Yeah, hi Sandesh. It's good to finally, meet like this on a virtual podcast platform. So yeah, it's always good to chat with you.
Yeah. Okay. So let's get straight into it, right? So I think when we were thinking about what to talk about, we kind of for the first episode, our thoughts kind of aligned, saying, hey, the first thing you want to think about in an AppSec program is to think about asset inventories, and both of us got really excited. But when you talk about asset inventories to anybody outside of AppSec, that sounds like a really boring topic. So can you kick us off by telling us what an asset inventory is and why it's important?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think the simplest way to think about it is, right, like for any organization, if you think about what assets mean to you and what do you do about those assets, the first statement that comes to me is, you can't protect your assets if you don't know what assets you have in the first place.
Yeah.
So I think the crux of asset inventory is everything your organization owns. It could be, software, it could be hardware, it could be third party libraries, vendors, anything, right? Like all of those could be clubbed into assets. So we can go deep into each one of these categories, or we can just strictly scope ourselves to the software asset inventory, which I think is more appropriate for this podcast.
Yeah. No, I mean, I agree with you, right? I mean, it's very hard to kind of imagine that the first thing you do in security is kind of like make a list of things that you have, right? And only then you kind of go ahead and protect it. So, I mean, you and I know each other from Cigital, right? When we worked together a long, long time ago. And I spent almost a decade in kind of the consulting world, right? And then, every few months, I would definitely at least meet a few new customers whom we've never worked with. And usually the first question I ask anyone who is in the application security space or who's responsible for application security is, hey, how many applications do you have, right? And honestly, the answer tells you a lot about the company, about the program, etc. Right? It would be weird. There were definitely some customers where if you talk to 3 different people in a company who are all somehow involved in the software development process, like you would get answers ranging from 1 to 40 to like 200. Right. So the person saying 1 is probably some kind of like a product owner. He's like, hey, we are an e-commerce company. We have a something.com. That's our product. So we have one application. Right. Whereas somebody else who kind of manages, like platform and manages internal dev tools, etc., will probably say, hey, we have 30 or 40 tools. We have an internal product for sellers. We have something for customer success people to kind of, manage support tickets. So we have like 30 or 40 applications. And then if you talk to another one, they'll say, no, we have 200 because, we have like a Tomcat server and that has a management console and that's an application too, right? Or somebody else says, we have a microservice. Now, do we count that as 4 or do we count that as 3, right? So the interesting thing about asset inventory for me is that, there's a saying in data science that all counting is political, right? So I think that's true here too, right? Like depending on how you count and what you count, the kind of things you choose to protect becomes very, very different, right? And I think that's really interesting. Every now and then though, I would get customers where everybody would say the exact same number, right? We have 374 applications. And that would always surprise me. And then I realized it's not that they have 374, but somebody's published this somewhere that we have 374 and everyone's read it, right? So that's how they come to a consensus, right? Not that think of it as the same way. But I think the point to make is useful, right? I mean, even though the exact number is not important, it's important to kind of have this conversation as a team. And it's really important, to also kind of think through this process, understand what your attack surface is, for lack of a better word, and then kind of take it from there. So I totally understand where you're coming from.
Yeah, and if I were to add to that, I think like as I've also spoken to different folks at different roles within different companies. So like you said, right, everybody's understanding about asset is significantly different. Like some of it could be, so I as an AppSec engineer, if I go speak to an engineer, like a software engineer, I think we can probably speak in the same language and we both understand what we are referring to when we say asset. But if I go talk to an EM or, like even a VP, right, like it always helps for me personally to make it crystal clear what I mean by asset, because they'll always have that follow-up questions, right? And this also kind of goes along, so I've actually worked in smaller startups and big enterprises, and pretty much every time I've interviewed in smaller startups, that's like the first question folks ask me is, if you were the first security hire, right? Like,
Hmm.
what would you do? And
Hmm.
almost every time I've answered, I need the asset inventory, the first thing, like that would be my first thing. And
Yeah.
almost in all cases, the folks who I was interviewing with, they agreed with that, because
Hmm.
they were dealing with that exact same problem. Is they
Problem.
had no freaking idea what is it that they need to protect. Yeah, it totally aligns with what you're saying.
Yeah. No, I think that's interesting that when you kind of start, right? Because if you think about a security engineer, if you think about a first security engineer, right, the first things that come to your mind are vulnerability and fixes and patches and bug bounty program and stuff like that. But
Mhm,
yeah, in
mhm.
reality, this is probably a place where you need to start. And it kind of gets complicated over time, right? I mean, so let's just kind of like take a step back and think about kind of how you can generate asset inventories, right? At least,
Yeah.
when I started out, and again, I've been doing this for a while, the most common things were spreadsheets. And like we said, it's okay to start wherever, as long as it works, right? Honestly, the way the first time I saw an asset inventory was essentially it's like a spreadsheet where people track stuff. You have like a program manager or a project manager who goes around asking people, hey, how many applications do you have? How many applications do you have? And so on and so forth. And
Yeah.
it gets complicated in the pre-cloud world because you don't know where they're deployed, so you can't query your cloud to kind of get the answers, right? So and
Mhm.
then there would be multiple hosting solution providers. So I think for the longest time, if you think about how to create an inventory, it was always mostly like interview based. You ask people questions, you maintain a system of record, and then maybe you did that interview every 3 months, right? And then
Yeah.
that's how you kind of
Yeah.
got it. The longest time, the automation piece of it was saying, hey, don't make it a spreadsheet, make it like an application, web application, where you have an interface to input data and you have an interface to view the data. So then you could do reporting and stuff like that, which is in a much better manner than how you would do, say, a spreadsheet. But still, the data
Yeah.
collection aspect of it was manual, and the accuracy would be as accurate as the day they did the exercise of collecting information, right? So
Yeah.
in many ways, that's kind of how I have seen companies kind of like think about generating an asset inventory. And then
Mhm.
if you also think about kind of like what, like you said, defining what an asset is really critical as well. And then that's another aspect to think about. I know for a fact that that's not how asset inventories are built today, right? Or at
Mhm.
least that's not the only way to build an asset inventory today, right? How do you see kind of asset inventories being built today? And how does the fact that everything's in the cloud, does it make it
Mhm.
easier to build an inventory? Does it make it harder? How do you look at it?
Yeah, and before I can answer that question, right, one thing to add to the previous point of doing
Hmm.
it via spreadsheet. Yes, so again, like when you think about where do you start, you don't
Hmm.
have the bandwidth to play with the tool. I have the same opinion as you. Just start somewhere,
Hmm.
even if it
Yeah.
is spreadsheet. And I've actually
Yeah.
gone through this exercise once in my previous workplace, and I think one thing that it helped with. So there are pros and cons. The cons is
Yeah.
obviously you have to keep it up to date, and that is just not
Hmm.
possible. Once you do
Yeah.
it, things change constantly, and that's a big problem, right? But the biggest pro that I see from this spreadsheet manual approach is, you know random people reach out to me,
Hmm.
saying that, look, I found this weird thing called asset inventory, and I have my system listed on this spreadsheet, and it's also good to see that there are other systems also listed. So unknowingly, that doing that exercise was actually helping others in the company,
Hmm.
which was actually validating, right? Because
Hmm.
again, it's not only a security problem. If you think about it, it is
Oh yeah.
asset inventory is a company problem. Like, IT
Hmm.
folks need to know
Yeah.
about the IT assets, right? So that is when I realized, right, like, you just start somewhere. You don't have to do it
Yeah.
the perfect way. Don't have to use a tool. Just start somewhere, right?
Yeah.
Now, getting back to your question about, like, how do I see asset inventory happening in this new world of cloud? So, obviously doing it programmatically is the way to go, using
Hmm.
APIs of, like, what have you. If an organization is on a cloud provider like AWS or GCP, pretty much all cloud providers, major cloud providers, have APIs, right, which you can
Hmm.
query to basically receive a list of all the assets which belong to that organization, right? But I think the biggest problem there is the ephemeral assets, right? Like, the same problem, right, which we had in the spreadsheet, like, how do you keep it up to date, becomes a problem here as well, right? Like, you have to automate it in a way that you can basically correlate or associate if an asset belongs to your organization or not. A good
Right.
example here could be, so let's say a company XYZ has an AWS S3 bucket called XYZ S3, right? Now, there could be different variants of it. There could be XYZ something, right? But then if they don't own this bucket anymore, and if they give away the ownership away, right? Like, somebody else can claim it, which is like a very
Yeah.
common
Yeah.
misconfiguration issue, right? So how do you keep control of all these assets that do belong to organization and then don't? So I think again the cloud world has its pros and cons. I think the biggest con I see is just kind of keeping it up to date, just because ephemeral assets in this cloud age, they come up and down constantly,
Yeah.
and that is very challenging, I think.
No, I think you raise a good point, and then it kind of gets me to another point, right? So we kind of spoke about saying, hey, how do you protect something you don't know exists and things like that? But that's theoretical, right? But what the example you gave is a real example, right?
Yeah.
One of the instances where we decided to kind of automate our entire software asset inventory was after Log4j, right? So we were with the company I was working for. We were not a Java shop, so we didn't have like a whole lot of Java applications, but we had some because data platforms are usually built on Java. And then when Log4 shell happened, right? The first question we asked was, okay, where are we using Log4, right? And just doing a search on GitHub is not enough, because it can be in third-party containers, it can be in a SaaS application you're using, it can be not be used but be deployed as a library for some reason, and you don't know if you need to upgrade it, right? So in many ways, just knowing which application, what's happening, etc., is really, really helpful. And the other kind of use case for us, for instance, is that when you get, like, let's take a really simple example, right? Let's take like a bug bounty report. So a bug bounty report comes for an endpoint, right? It comes from a URL. It says, hey, there's a SQL, there's an XSS on this page. Okay, now you're like a company with 1,000 developers and 200 applications. Who do you reach out to, right? That's really hard, because you have a subdomain. You don't have an application name. Like no developer owns a subdomain, right? So from that perspective as well, right? It's kind of solves the attribution problem, right? So the way I look at it is that in the cloud world, you can actually map like infra to deployments, to applications, to source code, to teams, right? And if you have that kind of link, and we'll talk a little bit about kind of like how we built it and kind of the tools that we use to do that. But I think that's the key, right? I mean, in reality, it's like, that's why you can't protect what you don't know exists, because when you get that bounty, you don't want to be scrambling to kind of find out who it is. Now, eventually, by calling enough people, you can find out. But imagine if you could do that at a click of a button, right? Like, and that's really kind of the the value of a software asset inventory for for security teams.
Yeah, I think both of us have worked with Cartography, which is again an open source graph based whatever software, right? That is built by Lyft. So I think we can speak on our experiences working with Cartography. But so like you mentioned, that is exactly what we use Cartography at Lyft, right? Like if a new bug bounty report comes in for a particular endpoint, we have the capability to query a graph for the person who is on call, who is responsible for that endpoint or for that domain, which again, if you think about it, I think in most cases you don't have that. I mean, even if you have that information, how do you stitch all of these pieces together to get the information you need? So I would love to know, I know you have some experience working with Cartography. I would love to know how you used it at the place where you worked at.
Yeah, sure. So before we do that, right, I mean, what you just described, saying, you have a URL and you can reach out the person, that freaking sounds like magic to someone who started in AppSec, in like 2012. Like if somebody had told me that was possible, I would have said, get out of here, right? I mean, you needed like multiple databases of people, and then multiple people to kind of keep things updated. Every time you have somebody pushes a code, you need to make an entry, you have a release checklist. I mean, the amount of bureaucracy that existed just to do this one thing was so high, and now all of them are API calls away, right? It's kind of like, it's magical, right? It's fascinating. So how we used Cartography was a little similar to what you said, but we had to make some changes. So before I answer that question, do you want to take like 30 seconds to explain what Cartography is to people who have never used it?
Yeah, absolutely. Actually, I am going to open because I don't want to describe Cartography in a way that it's not supposed to be. So I'm just opening it. So it's actually an open source tool built by Lyft. We'll provide the links in the show notes.
Yeah.
But if you go to the GitHub profile, it basically says Cartography is a Python tool that consolidates infrastructure assets and relationships between them in an intuitive graph view powered by a Neo4j database. So that's really Cartography, at a high level overview. But if you think about it, right, like you can imagine a graph, and that graph has different nodes, and each node has different attributes, right? Yeah. So you can define the way you think about assets in your organization using this graph-based approach. And it is really powerful, right? Because you can start with, so like you said, we can start with a domain and endpoint, and then we'll figure out, right, like which team owns that service which exposes this particular domain or the endpoint, and then you figure out which person is supposed to be on call for that service, right? So all that information combined together via a graph call, right? It becomes very easy. So that is essentially cartography. Again, it's been open source for quite a few years. There's a lot more advanced features. There's plugins for cloud providers and whatnot, right? So if you're interested, you can go to its repository, which is open source. And
like I said, it's an absolutely it's a great tool. I mean, massive kudos to the Lyft team, kind of like for open sourcing this. So the way we used it was kind of similar to what you said, but there were a couple of other nuances, right? So one, like you said, Lyft has a lot of connectors. I think they have a different name for it. They don't call it connectors; they call it something else, right? To connect to like different sources, right? So you could connect to Jira, you could connect to GitHub, you can connect to AWS, you can connect to Kubernetes, and like your EKS service, your Helm charts, and so on and so forth, right? So what we essentially did was, we connected to all of this and try to get all the information in a single graph database. But we kind of went a step further, and we also connected it to our vulnerability management. So we built some, we had something called Bhadra, which we recently open sourced as well, which is essentially our vulnerability management database. Think of it as like something similar to like a different dojo or something like that. And then essentially what it would mean is that if you give the name of a cloud resource, you could figure out which application is writing to it or reading from it. Okay. And then you could figure out what vulnerabilities are known open for that application as well. So you could basically map any part of an asset to any number of vulnerabilities and figure out what is responsible for when. Now, we did that and that was fascinating, but that was useless to everyone who's outside the application security because nobody kind of cares about that. So then what we decided, we said, hey, how do we make this useful for like the larger engineering org? So in our company, most of us, they use Looker as the business intelligence tool. So what we said was, we said, hey, instead of making the graph DB available for people or ability to query these things, we will think about the 10 most commonly asked questions in security meetings. So we used to have like review meetings with CTO every month where the same 10-15 questions are asked. So we said for those 10 questions, we're going to answer that question every morning. So every morning we would run the scan, using cartography and all the other intents that it's connected with, and that data is up to date. So anytime anybody in the company asks these critical questions about security, like how many vulnerabilities are open, are there S3 buckets which are exposed to the internet, who's asking where all is log4j being used. I mean, an executive doesn't ask this, but if there's an incident, then somebody would be asking this, right? So for all these top 10 questions, we had like static dashboards ready, which are updated every day, right? So basically the most important things for security were answered real time, and the core engine supporting that was cartography. And we kind of had like a great time kind of using that. My monthly meetings became super simple because all I had to do was take a screenshot and put it into the doc, right, where the reviews happened. And around the same time that we built this, S-bombs became a big deal. So we used a couple of open source tools to kind of run generate S-bombs, and then that kind of fed into that kind of became a source of input as well. So now essentially you could link your AWS infra to your deployment infra, which was EKS for us with Helm charts, and then which could be linked to your code repository in GitHub. And then the last part, which was kind of missing here, is how do you link this to people, right? And we were kind of struggling with that because we were getting larger, and the teams kept changing. Like the team which was working on microservice A is probably working on microservice C now. Microservice D is in maintenance mode, and so on and so forth, right? So shout out to Captain Nemo on Twitter, or Nemo as we call him, who came up with this pretty cool idea of saying, hey, let's have application manifests, right? So every GitHub repository had a manifest where they would answer questions which are impossible to answer from just querying stuff. So that would be things like, hey, what is the Slack channel we should reach out to if we have a question about this repository, right? Who is the owner of this repository? What team usually works on it? What BU does this belong to? That's it, right? So there were like 5 or 6 questions, and that's the only place where we use like a program manager to make sure that every repository in the company has that file, and then you can't do the next PR if you haven't updated the file, right? So the moment you have that, now you have infra, deployment, code, people, all of that available within a business intelligence tool that's visible to everybody in the company, or every stakeholder in the company, right? And that just allowed us to do so many things that we would have done manually otherwise, right? And like I said, right, it all started with a simple idea that we're like, hey, we don't know where all log4j is installed, and we had to like scramble to figure out where all it was installed, and using custom scripts and and stuff like that. And now, it grew into this thing. So, it was massively helpful for us when we built that out.
Yeah. No, I think one thing that you mentioned that piqued my interest is you hooked up cartography with your vulnerability management system, which is one way of doing it, right? At Lyft, we kind of treat cartography as a vulnerability management system. So now if you think about it, right, like we have the vulnerability information inside a graph, which again, I think,
Okay.
which empowers us to ask random questions, right? Like, do we have, let's say, for example, log4j installed in this container image or whatever, right? So I think again there are different ways of using cartography. I think
Yeah.
the power is in the graph based approaches is what I want to really highlight, right? So like you mentioned, if you can hook up cartography with whatever system you have, or if you want to treat cartography as a vulnerability management system, both approaches could work, and both are very powerful in the sense that the amount of information you can consume by just asking it simple queries, right? So yeah, I think there's some real value here. And to be honest, you're the first person who I've spoken. Like I've spoken to industry peers, who've been in the security industry for quite a few years, and
Yeah.
you're the first person who mentioned to me that you use cartography. Because again, like I joined Lyft recently. It's been a year, but I've always followed how cartography has been built,
Yeah.
right, over these
Yeah.
years. But I never got the chance because in order to implement a tool like cartography in any company, you have to get approvals. You have to convince your peers, your team members, everybody else, right? Like, let's use this graph-based approach for asset inventory. Let's start there and see how it changes. So when I joined Lyft and when I actually saw how it was being used, my mind was blown, man. I'm like,
Yeah.
yes, this is the way. This is the freaking way. And I was surprised why folks either they weren't aware of it, or the folks who built cartography, they didn't do a good job at marketing. I don't know, but I think for folks who are listening to us, and if you're struggling with asset inventory, I at least highly recommend use at least take a look at cartography. It doesn't hurt. And yeah, so I mean, there are other companies that follow the same approach of graph based.
Sure.
Like I think you mentioned this Jupiter One,
Yeah.
and there's like a little bit of interesting history. There is Sasha Fast who worked for Microsoft, and he along with Alex, I think they were the two folks who built cartography at Lyft when Sasha was still at Lyft, right? And then I think Sasha left Lyft to join Jupiter One at some point. And Jupiter One was also, I think, trying to use the graph-based approach to build their solution, whatever it was. So yeah, it's a very interesting history of if you speak to the founders and of this awesome tool, and I think there's real value here.
No, I think you kind of raise another interesting point as well as to why not many companies we know of use cartography. And I think again this is probably a little bit of a deviation from software asset inventory, but hey, it's our podcast, right? So so I think the way I think about it, right, it's actually pretty hard to always use like open source tools in like largish company settings to do something, because in the end it kind of becomes a question of, hey, who's going to maintain this? What happens if this person leaves the company? And it depends on the culture within the company as well. So Razorpay, where we implemented this, had like a pretty strong engineering culture. There was more than engineering culture, there was a strong experimentation culture. So we didn't mind experimenting with things. And bear in mind, the beauty of something like this is that it's off the pipeline. Like to me, if anything's being integrated into the pipeline, then you've got to be super careful of what you're doing, because it can have downstream impact, right? But if you do it right, so the tool that was running when we were running cartography, it only had read access to everything, because it doesn't need to modify anything, right? It's an inventory, it's a read-only system by design, right? So it's not taking any action. So if you can design it securely and kind of make sure that, hey, only read-only access, all it does is call APIs, and it's displayed in a system where there's already some kind of RBAC already built in, then you kind of are able to kind of solve a lot of problems. But there's no question that adopting it took a significant dev effort, right? So we definitely had developers working on this full time to get that done, and not everybody has that luck. So I think it's great that there are commercial tools available now, because I think this is one of those very non-sexy, boring problems. Also the topic of this podcast, right? Which actually have critical impact, right? So though it may sound like a boring problem, but it has like a real impact on security. And I'm glad there are companies trying it. I hear there are more number of companies kind of trying to build this out as well, which is great. I think there's a lot more we can do with graph databases and inferences. I think the cloud security world, right? Like the Wiz and the PingSafes of the world, they've actually done a pretty good job of using like graph DB type technology to kind of help you determine exploitation and stuff like that.
Yeah.
right? But I think at AppSec we haven't seen that. Like a long time ago, you would have tools like AppScan give you that weird graph thing where it drew like a line from source to sink on which
Yeah.
functions were called. But ever since then, I haven't seen too much in terms of graphical representation of vulnerabilities, possibility of exploitation in the AppSec world. So
Yeah.
maybe this sparks off some imagination somewhere, and we'll see more things happen.
Yeah, and as we've been maturing as an industry over the years, right? There's
Mhm.
this new trend where people speak about reachability analysis, right? So, just having the presence of a third-party library in your code doesn't necessarily mean it is vulnerable, or doesn't
Hmm.
necessarily imply that somebody has to go fix something, right?
Yeah.
What folks really want to know is if that piece of vulnerable library can be exploited, and for that you need to understand how code flows from source to sink, right? So this
Yeah.
concept of reachability analysis, which you see more and more vendors in the product, right? Like I know SEMREP has that concept, and I
Yeah.
know like there are some other SaaS tools as well, right? I think something like the reachability analysis, and I say this because I think it can easier if you implement it from a graph based approach, right? Because you already have the graph, you can link, the code to the person who wrote the code in a pretty intuitive way, right? Because you
Hmm.
are building a graph in that way, right? So I think again, if you don't want to invest,
Hmm.
in some of these vendors, and if you want to sort of get a better understanding of the risk that your organization faces, and you're a small team, right? I think using something like cartography and
It's a
being
good
able
starting point.
to,
Yeah.
right, it's an awesome starting point. So yeah, just wanted to mention that also. It wouldn't be fair, right, if we just kept speaking all good things about cartography, right? Cartography,
Yeah.
as any other software for that matter, right,
Yeah.
has
Yeah.
cons as well, right? And since Lyft built cartography, I've been at the forefront of sort of dealing with some of these issues, right? So
Mhm.
just wanted to mention that those things as well, right? Like there's no concept of historical information being present in cartography. Like you can modify it, you can append it, right? You can hook cartography with a database, but cartography by default, it does not give you the historical context or the
Right.
historical analysis. So if a new asset comes up, you don't
Yeah.
know if the asset existed yesterday or not. So that is, I think, in my book, right? Like it's one of the features that is, I'm pretty sure it wasn't implemented because of a valid reason, but I think
Hmm.
that's one of the biggest con that I see is I want to know if an asset existed yesterday, 3 days
Yesterday.
from now,
Yeah.
4 days from now, right? But that information is just not there,
Hmm.
and you would have to make some changes to it. So
Building the top
I
of it.
think, yeah. So I don't know if you experience that
Yeah,
when
I
you.
mean, we did experience that, but we kind of solved that by right, like you said, right? We had stuff in our database, and then we had alerting on top of it. So cartography was like the data
Mm,
collection engine, but the
mm,
inference and the intelligence engine was built on top of that, right?
yeah,
The other, since we're talking about things that don't always work well, I think the graph DB, the whole Neo4j thing, works really well for power users, but it's still
mm,
super wonky. It's like like
yes,
just click, like you don't know what bubbles to click on, you don't know what query to ask. Like who remembers S3 bucket names anyway, right? It's like
yeah,
who remembers the exact name of the microservice, and then you got to play around with regex. So I think yeah, I mean, we always looked at cartography as like a platform to build on top of, right? And
yeah,
not
yeah,
as like a be all and the end all, right? In that, I'm a
yeah,
big believer that changing behavior is hardest thing to do, right? So if you really don't want to try and change the behavior of the users who are going to use this, so you got to
yeah,
go where they are, right? So if they are in Jira, then find a way to give visibility within Jira. Like whatever tools you use, if you're using a business, if you're using Power BI, then these have to become Power BI graphs. Like the only thing everybody does is read emails, then you got to generate graphs from cartography, take a screenshot and send it as an email, right? Like
yeah,
write a
yeah,
Zapier rule or whatever to send the email, right? So I mean, you're right, I think, but the database thing is interesting. So if cartography can come with like some kind of inherent support to kind of match state and look at a previous scan
yeah,
and a current scan and look at the difference and highlight things which may sound dangerous, then that
yeah.
stops being an inventory now and it actually becomes a full-blown security tool.
Yeah, and I don't know if you've experienced, this problem, but every company I've worked at, pretty much,
Hmm.
I've struggled to sort of get the historical analysis of like an asset or anything, right? Like in other
Hmm.
words, right? If a
Yeah.
new domain shows up, right?
Hmm.
I haven't worked anywhere where it was easy to just kind of find out if this particular asset existed yesterday or not. It's just a very
Yeah.
basic problem, which I think is important in in more so in the AppSec world, because we need to scale ourselves, this it's just not possible for us to scan everything all day every day. We only
Yeah.
want to know if something changed, and if whatever change is of high priority to the company, if it introduces
Yeah.
risk, and only at that point we need to do something on that thing,
Yeah.
right? So I think if any vendor, or if anybody is listening to this podcast, I would highly recommend to think about this problem where you kind of provide an end user the capability to figure out, yeah, what changed, when it changed, when was it first introduced. I know some vendors do that, but
Yeah. Yeah.
majority
Yeah.
of this vendors I've seen, they don't. And it's always the fact that the teams have to build their own way of differentiating what changed, how
Yeah.
it changed, all of that. Yeah.
Yeah, look, it brings up like another interesting aspect, right? So if you think about like a cloud security tool, they do that for cloud assets. If you think about an API security tool, they'll do that for like an API inventory. And in the end, as if you're the head of, I mean, look, I'm building my own company now, so hope maybe I'll do something like that as well. But I think one of the issues, right, and I think a bunch of VCs and people who do industry watching are talking about it a lot right now. I mean, they've been talking about it for a while right now. Is that this whole aspect of point solutions for everything in security is kind of what creates this problem, right? Like within application security, like you have what, like a dozen tools if you want to do everything, right? And I always remember the SKCD cartoon. I'll link this from the show notes where there's like, oh, there are 11 standards. This is too many. We need to have like one standard, and they say we'll create a new standard which is just like one of them, right? And then what's next is now we have 12 standards, right? So because we thought we'll just create the one big one, and then it became another one, right? So I mean, the way I look at it is that it's also a problem that even our inventories are siloed, right? So your API inventory doesn't talk to your cloud inventory, doesn't talk to your database inventory, and so on and so forth. Okay, not database inventory, it's part of the cloud, but they don't talk to each other that well. So I think, I hope this doesn't mean there'll be another single pane of glass security startup that comes out. But I think it's a real, I mean, there's a reason why there are so many single pane of glass security startups, because it's a real problem, right? Just that the solution is non-obvious. And you're right, right? One inventory which tells you only about the changes that matter would be golden. But until we have that, I guess we'll have to still continue building it in-house.
Yeah, and like to add to that, I think one of the biggest problems why this does not exist is the lack of contextualization and attribution between different kinds of assets. Cloud asset versus an API asset versus an application asset, right? And again, this is where cartography could come handy, right? Where you could associate a software asset with a hardware asset, right? So on and so forth.
Yeah.
So again, it makes sense why something like this feature, like what change feature, could be really handy. Also, before I forget, the other, I think the biggest con, which I think you gave a hint about with cartography, is the fact that it is built using Neo4j, right? And
Yeah.
the graph, the adoption rate of Neo4j in any company is very low, and the primary reason is because it's a very difficult language to just kind of grok,
Yeah.
and being able to write queries in a way that you are asking the graph the right thing that you want to get, right? So
Yeah.
that's always going to be a problem. And I think in today's world where AI seems to be a trend, there are some solutions, or at least like some places where I've seen where people are hooking their generative AI on cartography, right? So
Oh, wow.
they're just trying to make that problem easy, where instead of writing a query in Neo4j, you could just ask, right, show me all the domains that are externally facing. So yeah, I'll provide some of these links in the show notes. Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's great. That sounds. I mean, the possibilities obviously there seem endless now. That at least for deriving insights, you don't need to kind of sit and write those queries. You can probably just ask, and then that may happen. That sounds interesting. So just to wrap up, right? So let's kind of like summarize what we spoke about, right? So I think we kind of started off by talking about kind of just like why we need like software asset inventories. Anshuman mentioned that IT has always had it, and now for regular assets like for your laptops and your hardware and stuff, and why software asset inventory is important doesn't seem like a security problem, but it's like critical for security. So that's kind of the first thing we spoke about. We spoke about kind of the evolution of how software asset inventories have been built over time, from spreadsheets to applications which capture some of the information, to like modern tools like cartography, which kind of which make it much simpler to develop some of these. Then we spoke in depth about cartography, like a great open source tool which helps helps you do this from left, and a few commercial tools as well who kind of help you do this. And then finally, we kind of spoke about some of the things that can get even better with asset inventories, where we just don't focus on inventories but on intelligence, like things like answering specific questions like, hey, what changed, and which of these changes were really critical, let's say over the last 24 hours. So is that a good summary, Anshuman? Did I miss anything?
Yeah, no, I think that was pretty spot on. Yeah, I just to add to that, right? Like, I think software asset inventory or just asset inventory in general is a topic that I know there are companies getting started around this, but I don't hear a lot of AppSec or product security folks speaking about how have they tried to solve this problem at their place, right? So I would love to see if folks have solved it in other innovative ways, because I think it's one of the biggest problems in our industry, right? Like asset, how do you even get a hold of your asset? So yeah, would love to hear from folks who have other ideas that we can share more about.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, cool. So that kind of brings us to the end of the topic. So we want to kind of end every episode with like talking about one thing which we found interesting in the week, in the last week or the last 2 weeks, right? And I'll go first, Anshuman, so you get a little bit time to think, right?
Yeah.
So because I'd already thought about mine before I started the episode. So I saw this tweet earlier today. We're recording this on the 9th of February for reference, right? I think Gemini AI was was available for everyone as of yesterday. And then there's a professor at Princeton, I think Arvind Narayan is his name, and he posted this really interesting tweet of like playing rock paper scissors with AI chatbots. And what he would do is he would play rock paper scissors a few times, where he would ask the chatbot to first go first, and then he goes again, and obviously he wins every time, right? And then after playing it like 4 times, he would ask, hey, why do you think I keep winning? And he says so he put the screenshot of what Gemini says, and it guesses correctly that that, hey, if I go first and then you go, then you have an advantage, so obviously you win every time. But then he said that he kind of indicated that most AI chatbots don't do this. So then I obviously went and tried this in ChatGPT, and yeah, ChatGPT essentially tells you the reason this happens. The reason I'm able to win all the time, it's because I chose paper and the bot chose rock. So paper covers rock. So it's actually telling you why I won that particular game. And then it's essentially saying that, hey, your choices effectively counted mine in both instances, leading to your consecutive wins, right? It says it's a mix of strategy, prediction, and chance, right? Whereas in reality, and the reason I found this really interesting is that, including me, by the way, who's kind of building a company in the GenAI space, we tend to kind of trying to move away from deterministic systems to predictive ones, like like generative ones. And I feel like it's really interesting to think about what sort of things these tools cannot do well, right? And these seem to be something which would I would have never thought that ChatGPT or other chatbots would have a hard time doing this. It just opens your eyes to saying, hey, proceed with caution, right? Maybe these tools will get better over time. Gemini already seems to give the right answer, but it's very interesting. There are a lot of hidden dark corners in the GenAI world, and as we kind of build solutions on top of it, something to just keep in mind.
Yeah. Actually, I also saw that tweet, and I think Bard became this new thing, right? Google.
I mean, I'm confused. Like they launched Gemini, but now Bar.Google is Gemini.Google or whatever. But yeah, the interface looks similar, but it's a new model.
Okay,
underneath the chatbot.
Yeah. No, that's that is interesting to think about how these edge cases or these use cases could be solved if they can be solved, right? Because I have started to worry about, am I going to have a job or not in a few years? I'm sure I will, right? But it's just something to think about, because we are essentially trying to solve our problems by using AI. And, at like some point, it like either all our problems will just go away, which I hope it does not. But yeah, it for sure is.
I mean, look, since you brought that up, I think the 2 points, I've thought a lot about this, and there are 2 points that which like I remember all the time now. So one, one is the whole, do you know the horse manure story? It's a very popular story now, but I'll repeat it if you haven't heard about it.
I don't.
Okay, the horse manure story is, I'm terrible with dates, but this is like a couple of centuries ago. Basically, everybody started owning horses in London. So everybody had a horse. right? And then there was like this big editorial in one of the big newspapers, essentially saying that horses go to poop, right? So everybody has a horse, which means all the horses poop, and they poop all over London. And there was this whole thing where they came to the conclusion that London will cease to exist as a modern city because it'll be covered in horse manure, because everybody has a horse. There are too many horses, and that they're going to be pooping everywhere, right? Sounds familiar, right? Like too many people coming in, too many, like overpopulation, like very similar to every modern problem, right? But we know today that London is not completely overridden by horse manure, and the reason that happened is not because somebody made like a better horse, or they made like horse manure treatment plants or any of that, because Ford invented cars, right? And then the motor car was invented, and then horses were replaced by cars, right? So I don't think the journalist who wrote that article would have ever imagined that this is how this problem is solved, right? But I think that's how it gets solved, right? So every new technology kind of comes in and changes things in a way that you don't expect. It's not obvious in the most obvious way. The obvious thing maybe, hey, if it can do my job, then maybe I don't have a job. But I think I don't know.
Yeah,
Historically,
yeah.
it kind of gives me hope that we'll learn to do different things and we'll learn to do things better. That's one. The second interesting aspect, I think, is that I'm based out of Bangalore. I know you're based out of in San Diego, and I think the way I think about things is that even today there are so many areas which are untouched by software, right? I mean,
Oh yeah.
the world we live in, we assume we have too many software engineers and too many tech people, but that's not true. There's just so much else to be done. So if one developer can do the job of 5 developers, and if one security engineer can do the job of 5 security engineers, I don't think that means the other 4 lose their jobs. I think that means there'll be different areas
They'll
of
be
the
working on
world.
different problems. Yeah.
Exactly, right. So because now so many more problems can be solved through software, because our productivity has gone up, right? I do
Yeah.
worry about people just getting out of college, because I think we are a lucky generation in the sense that we learn to do these things the boring way, and now we get like the productivity boost, so we understand kind of the from the first
Yeah.
principles. But when I said this to someone, they said, hey, this is what they said when you started using calculators in engineering. They said, yeah, if you don't know how to if you don't learn how to do addition, then using the calculator will mean you will forget how to add numbers.
Yeah.
That didn't happen, so why will this happen, right? So anyway, I mean, I cannot tend to look at it a little more positively,
Yeah.
and maybe it's just because I don't want to have anxiety about the future, but yeah, let's see how things shape up.
Yeah, no, I think it is really powerful what you just like said, right? Like I
Hmm.
hear the same thing from folks is like AI is going to take away their jobs, right? But if you think about it, if that were to happen, people will find
Hmm.
different problems to work on
Yeah,
because that is what
yeah,
humans do. And
yeah.
I heard a very similar thing recently on a different podcast, and that kind of resonated with me. Yeah, so it's not like we are going to run out of problems, but there
Yeah,
will be problems no matter what, right? Like
yeah.
and yeah, we will figure it out. So yeah, it's a
And
very
if we run out of all problems on Earth, then somebody's going to go to Mars, and then we'll solve problems on Mars, right? Like
yeah,
we'll
yeah,
just figure this out.
yeah, yeah, man, absolutely.
All right. Is there anything you want to talk about that you can't stop thinking about over the last few weeks?
So again, this is going to be completely unrelated to software security or just software in general.
Sure.
But yeah, so again, to give some context, I have two boys. My eldest, like son, is 3 years, and my
Hmm.
youngest is about to turn 1.
Hmm.
And recently, like, and Sandesh, you have a child, so you
Daughter.
can
Yeah.
relate to me as well, right? So,
Yeah.
like the rate at which their brain develops is freaking
Yeah.
crazy. Like they wake
Yeah.
up and suddenly they start doing things, they start saying things. I'm like, how did you even learn that, right? So
Yeah.
recently, for the past couple of weeks or so, my eldest like son, his name is Ahir. um,
Hmm.
he he gets hung on to like one thing, right? Like if he would
Hmm.
want to do something, and if he does not get to do it, or if we say that don't do that, I hear, he'll just get hung on to it, and he'll just keep
All day
repeating it
long.
non-stop. I'm like,
Yeah.
stop, man. And I get so frustrated, and my wife Shilpa, she keeps reminding me that you have to validate their feelings. You have to
Hmm.
validate their feelings. You cannot expect them to be practical like you are.
Yeah.
So that is what I did today. There was an incident, and without going into too much details,
Yeah.
because
Yeah.
again, like he got hung onto that thing, and he kept saying it, and I kept repeating it with him, and I kept saying, "I'm sorry, I hear you," and he was fine after 2 minutes. I'm like,
Yeah.
wow, that actually worked. So like when you hear things like validate feelings, I really didn't know what that means,
That
right?
means. Yeah.
But I think today I realize what that means is you just repeat what the other person is saying, so that the other
Yeah.
person feels like I'm hearing them out.
Yeah.
Man, so this was something that happened today. So that was on my
Parenting unlocked, right? It's
Yes,
like it's
yes.
like you got like a level up. You finished like one level and go to
Yeah,
like level 5
yeah.
on parenting, right?
Which reminds me, this is something we could do at the end of every episode, because you are a parent, I'm a parent, and I'm sure we learn so many things on a daily basis, right? So
Yeah.
yeah, it's pretty funny
Yeah.
and interesting.
Yeah, and it's like I mean, we both come from like traditional cultures, right, which has like a lot of intelligence and a lot of wisdom on parenting and stuff. And kind of, I'm kind of the guy who questions most of these things. But
Yes.
the one person whose parenting advice I kind of really enjoyed is actually from an economist. Her name is Emily Oster. So look it up. She writes a lot on parenting. I think she has like the most popular parenting Substack in the world or whatever. And
Okay.
I mean, she's obviously a full time parent, but she's also an economist. And the lens she brings in is like really really interesting. But yeah, in general, I think it just opens you up to many different aspects of life on how to think about it. And yeah, the thing you said is like crazy. Like the one thing, maybe we'll keep more parenting hacks and questions to later
Yeah.
episodes. But yeah, I'm with you, man. Like validating their feelings and talking them, and partaking their misery with them
Yeah.
usually works better than saying no.
That's all they need. That's all they need. Yeah. Yeah.
Awesome. This is
Awesome.
great. Hey, thanks a lot for joining, Anshuman. I think this was great fun. We'll do this again. We'll do the next one shortly as well. And thanks everybody for listening. If you have questions for us, if you want us to talk about more things, if you want us to stop talking about AI for once or parenting, let us know in the comments, and we'll respond to every comment, and we'll see how the next episode goes. Thanks, Anshuman.
Thank you, Sandesh.
Thank you for joining us. If you like the show, please share this with your friends and colleagues. If you have any questions or comments, you can reach Anshuman on Twitter at Anshuman_BH. That's ANSHUMAN_BH. And me, Sandesh, at Jubba on Jeans. That's JUBBAONJEANS. See you next time.